I should have known something was wrong when the headaches started getting worse. At first, I thought it was just the usual stress from running my small architecture firm in downtown Portland. Between client meetings, design deadlines, and trying to keep up with Daniel's social calendar, I was burning the candle at both ends. My husband always said I worked too hard, but that's how I built my business from nothing. The morning everything changed started like any other Tuesday. I was making coffee in our kitchen, the one with the big windows overlooking the garden Daniel loved so much. One moment I was reaching for my favorite mug. The next, I was waking up in a hospital bed with tubes coming out of my arms and the steady beep of machines around me. Cerebral aneurysm, the doctor explained when I was finally coherent enough to understand. You're lucky your neighbor heard the crash when you fell. We need to operate immediately. The next few weeks became a blur of surgical procedures, recovery rooms, and that awful hospital smell that seems to stick to everything. My phone and laptop were locked away in a drawer somewhere, the nurses insisting I needed complete rest. No work emails, no client calls, nothing that could stress me out and risk another episode. Daniel visited every day at first, and I was grateful for that. He'd bring fresh flowers from our garden, usually the white roses I loved, and sit beside my bed telling me about his day. He worked as a financial consultant downtown, and he'd update me on his clients and meetings. But something felt different about him during those visits. He'd check his phone constantly, even while talking to me, and there was this restless energy about him that I'd never seen before. You don't have to stay if you have work to do, I told him one afternoon when he'd glanced at his phone for the third time in 10 minutes. No, I want to be here, he'd say, but his eyes would dart to the door like he was planning his escape. I trusted him completely back then. We'd been married for 5 years, together for 8, and he'd always been my rock. When my grandmother passed away 3 months before my accident, leaving me a substantial inheritance, Daniel was the one who helped me navigate all the paperwork and bank transfers. He understood finances better than I did, and I was grateful to have someone I could rely on to handle the practical stuff while I grieved. The inheritance was life-changing money, enough to expand my firm and maybe even buy that bigger house we'd been talking about. Daniel had been so supportive, helping me set up the transfer when the funds came through, even suggesting we put it in our joint account for easier access. We're a team, he'd said. What's yours is mine, right? Lying in that hospital bed, watching him fidget with his phone and glance at the clock, I pushed down the nagging feeling that something was off. He was under stress too, I reasoned. Having your wife suddenly collapse and need brain surgery wasn't exactly easy to handle. The bills were piling up despite our insurance, and he was probably worried about money on top of everything else. I love you, I'd whisper when he'd finally put his phone away and hold my hand. I love you too, he'd reply. But even his kisses felt distracted, like his mind was somewhere else entirely. The nurses kept telling me how lucky I was to have such a devoted husband, how he called every day to check on my progress even when he couldn't visit. I smiled and agreed, but deep down, something felt wrong. I just couldn't put my finger on what it was. If I'd known what he was really doing during those long hospital days, while I was fighting for my life hooked up to machines, I would have seen it coming. But trust is a funny thing. Once you give it completely to someone, it's hard to imagine they could be capable of destroying it so thoroughly. After almost 4 weeks in the hospital, I was finally cleared to go home. The doctors were amazed at my recovery, and I felt stronger than I had in months. I'd been looking forward to this moment, imagining Daniel's relieved smile when I walked through our front door, maybe some flowers on the kitchen table, or my favorite takeout from that Thai place on Morrison Street. Instead, I walked into silence. The house felt cold and empty, like nobody had been living in it for weeks. There were no welcome home decorations, no smell of dinner cooking, no Daniel rushing to help me with my bags, just the echo of my footsteps in the hallway and dust particles floating in the afternoon light. I called out for him, but got no answer. His car wasn't in the driveway, so I figured he was still at work. Maybe he'd lost track of time, or maybe the discharge happened earlier than he expected. I tried not to feel disappointed as I made my way to the bedroom and started unpacking the few things I'd accumulated during my stay. The first thing I noticed was how neat everything looked. Too neat. Daniel was usually pretty messy, leaving clothes on the floor and papers scattered on his desk. But everything was organized, almost like he'd been cleaning up after himself more carefully than usual. I found that odd, but didn't think much of it at the time. Over the next few days, Daniel seemed different. He was attentive when he was home, asking about my recovery and making sure I had everything I needed. But he was gone more often than usual, claiming he had extra client meetings and work dinners to catch up on. Things got behind while I was spending so much time at the hospital, he explained, which made sense, but little things started bothering me. Mail had been piling up unopened, including some important-looking envelopes from the bank. When I asked Daniel about it, he said he'd been too stressed to deal with paperwork and had just been letting it accumulate. Some bills were overdue, which wasn't like us at all. We'd always been good about staying on top of our finances. One morning, while Daniel was at work, I decided to organize the mess. I went to our home office to get our shared safe where we kept important documents. That's when I noticed things were missing. The folder with our investment statements wasn't there. Neither was the paperwork from my grandmother's estate. I searched everywhere, thinking maybe Daniel had moved them for safekeeping, but they were just gone. Then I found receipts, lots of them, stuffed in the back of a drawer like someone had tried to hide them. Expensive dinners at restaurants I'd never been to. Hotel charges from places I'd never heard of. A jewelry purchase from Tiffany for over $3,000. I'd never seen any jewelry from Tiffany. My hands were shaking as I sat down at the computer and logged into our joint bank account. What I saw made my blood run cold. The balance was almost zero. The entire inheritance from my grandmother, nearly $200,000, was gone. Just gone. I scrolled through the transaction history with growing horror. Multiple transfers to an account I didn't recognize, all made while I was in the hospital. The largest single transfer was for $50,000, made on a day when Daniel had told me he couldn't visit because he had food poisoning. The account name on the transfers made me physically sick. Clara Mendoza. I knew that name. I knew it because I'd seen it before in text messages on Daniel's phone that I'd discovered 2 years ago. Messages that were way too friendly for someone who was supposed to be just a work colleague. Messages that had nearly ended our marriage before it really began. She's nobody, Daniel had sworn to me back then, when I confronted him about the flirty texts and the late-night phone calls. Just someone from the office. I barely know her. I'll cut all contact, I promise. And I'd believed him. I'd believed him because I loved him. Because I wanted to trust him. Because the alternative was too painful to consider. We'd gone to couples counseling. He'd changed his phone number. And things had seemed to get better. I thought we'd moved past it. But here was her name again, attached to my inheritance money. Transferred while I was unconscious in a hospital bed recovering from brain surgery. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. I sat there staring at the computer screen, trying to process what this meant. It wasn't just about the money, though losing my grandmother's legacy felt like losing her all over again. It was about trust, about the man I'd married, about the life I thought we were building together. I heard Daniel's car in the driveway and quickly closed the laptop. I needed time to think, to figure out what to do next. When he walked through the door with Chinese takeout and that same distracted smile, I managed to pretend everything was normal. But inside, I was already planning my next move. I didn't sleep that night. While Daniel snored peacefully beside me, I stared at the ceiling and planned my investigation. I knew I needed more than just bank records if I was going to get my money back and hold him accountable. I needed proof of everything, and I needed to be smart about how I got it. The next morning, after Daniel left for work, I called in sick to my own office and got to work. First, I recovered Daniel's deleted emails from our shared computer. He thought he was being clever, but he'd forgotten that our backup system automatically saved everything to the cloud. What I found there made me physically nauseous. Months of correspondence with Clara, starting just 2 weeks after my grandmother's funeral. Not just love letters, though there were plenty of those, but detailed plans about the money. They'd been planning this for months, waiting for the right opportunity. Daniel had even joked about how convenient my aneurysm was, giving them the perfect cover to move the funds without me noticing. But it got worse. Daniel hadn't just stolen the money and given it to Clara. He'd created an elaborate fake investment scheme to cover his tracks. Using his financial expertise, he'd forged documents making it look like I had willingly invested the inheritance in Clara's fake business, something called Pacific Coast Wellness Solutions. The paperwork looked official, complete with my forged signature and fake business registration documents. I spent the next 2 days documenting everything, I took screenshots, printed emails, and made multiple backup copies of all the evidence. Then I hired a private investigator, a woman named Sarah Chen, who came highly recommended by my lawyer friend Jennifer. Sarah was worth every penny. Within a week, Sarah had uncovered the full scope of their deception. Clara had been posting pictures on social media from expensive trips and luxury hotels, always carefully cropping Daniel out of the photos. But Sarah knew how to trace metadata and location tags. She connected every one of Clara's solo vacations to Daniel's supposed business trips during my hospital stay. The most damning evidence came from a luxury resort in Napa Valley. While I was having my second surgery, fighting for my life with machines keeping me breathing, Daniel and Clara were drinking champagne in a 5-star hotel room that cost more per night than most people make in a week. Sarah had hotel records, credit card receipts, even security camera footage of them together in the lobby. Sarah also discovered that Clara had been living a double life for months. She'd rented an expensive apartment in the Pearl District, using my grandmother's money, telling the landlord she was a successful wellness entrepreneur. She'd bought a new car, designer clothes, expensive jewelry. She was living like a queen on money that belonged to me, money that was supposed to honor my grandmother's memory and secure my future. The business registration for Pacific Coast Wellness Solutions was completely fraudulent. Sarah traced it to a fake address and discovered that Clara had never filed any proper paperwork with the state. It was all smoke and mirrors, designed to make the money transfer look legitimate if anyone questioned it later. But the most heartbreaking discovery was a series of text messages between Daniel and Clara from the day of my surgery. While I was under anesthesia, having my skull opened up to save my life, Daniel was texting Clara about dinner reservations and how excited he was to finally be free from his boring wife and start their new life together. I printed everything: bank records, emails, photos, hotel receipts, fake business documents, text messages, social media posts with location data. I filled 3 binders with evidence and made digital copies of everything, storing them in multiple secure locations. By the time I was done, I had enough evidence to not only get my money back, but to send both of them to prison for fraud and embezzlement. The hardest part was pretending everything was normal when Daniel came home each night. He'd ask about my recovery, bring me dinner, even suggest we start planning a vacation once I was feeling better. The irony wasn't lost on me that he was planning another trip, while he'd already taken several with his girlfriend using my money. "How was work today?" I'd ask, watching him lie to my face about client meetings when I knew he'd actually spent the afternoon apartment hunting with Clara, looking for an even more expensive place to live. "Busy, but good," he'd say, kissing my forehead like the devoted husband everyone thought he was. I started working with Jennifer on my legal strategy. We had enough evidence for criminal charges, but we also wanted to make sure I could recover every penny of my inheritance, plus damages for the emotional trauma and betrayal. Jennifer was confident we had an airtight case, but she advised me to be patient and let Daniel dig himself in deeper before we made our move. The waiting was torture, but I knew she was right. Every day Daniel continued his deception gave us more evidence. Every lie he told, every fake business trip, every romantic dinner with Clara paid for with my grandmother's money, just made our case stronger. I was building an arsenal, and when the time came to use it, I wanted to make sure the destruction was complete and irreversible. The hardest part wasn't gathering evidence or planning my revenge. It was pretending to be the same trusting wife Daniel thought he'd left behind in that hospital bed. Every morning, I had to wake up and play the role of the recovering patient who needed his help and support. I cooked his favorite meals, asked him to help me with simple tasks I could easily do myself, and listened to his lies with a concerned, loving expression. "You're getting stronger every day," he'd say, watching me struggle to open a jar that I'd already loosened when he wasn't looking. "I'm so proud of how you're handling everything." Meanwhile, Jennifer and I were putting together our legal strategy. The divorce papers were ready, along with a civil lawsuit for theft, fraud, and emotional distress. But I wanted more than just legal victory. I wanted Daniel and Clara to experience the same shock and helplessness I'd felt when I discovered their betrayal. I started with Clara. Using a fake email address and the name Michelle Torres, I reached out to her about her wellness business. I pretended to be a wealthy investor from Seattle who'd heard about Pacific Coast wellness solutions through mutual connections. Clara took the bait immediately, probably seeing dollar signs and another opportunity to expand her fraudulent operation. "I'm very interested in what you're building," I wrote. "I'd love to learn more about your business model and discuss a potential partnership." Clara responded within hours, eager to set up a video call. She had no idea she was walking into a trap. During our 40-minute Zoom meeting, she laid out her entire fake business plan, complete with fabricated client testimonials and made-up revenue projections. She even showed me the apartment she was living in, the same one I'd discovered through Sarah's investigation. "This is all funded through private investors who believe in my vision," she explained, gesturing around the expensive furniture that my grandmother's money had bought. I recorded everything: her admissions about the fake business, her lies about the funding sources, even her casual mentions of trips and purchases that I knew came from my inheritance. She had no idea she was confessing to fraud on camera, creating evidence that would be admissible in court. But I wasn't done with Clara yet. Through Sarah's investigation, I'd learned that her fancy apartment was owned by my cousin Marcus, who managed several rental properties in the Pearl District. I'd grown up with Marcus, and while we weren't particularly close, family was family. I called him and explained the situation, showing him proof that Clara was living in his property using stolen money. Marcus was furious. Not only was Clara a criminal, but her lease application had been filled with lies about her income and employment. He started eviction proceedings immediately, giving her 3 days to vacate for lease violations and fraudulent application materials. Next, I reported Pacific Coast Wellness Solutions to the Oregon Department of Consumer and Business Services for operating without proper registration and making fraudulent business claims. I also filed complaints with the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center and the Federal Trade Commission. Within days, Clara's bank accounts were flagged for investigation and temporarily frozen pending a full audit. Daniel had no idea what was coming. He continued his routine of fake concern and phony affection, all while planning his future with Clara. Sarah had discovered they were looking at houses together, expensive properties in West Hills that they planned to buy once they figured out how to access more of our money. The thought of them house hunting with my inheritance made me physically sick, but it also motivated me to move faster. On a Thursday morning, while Daniel was supposedly in a client meeting, but actually at a furniture store with Clara picking out bedroom sets, I had him served with divorce papers at his office. I made sure the process server arrived during his lunch break, when the most people would be around to witness it. Along with the divorce petition, he received a lawsuit for theft, embezzlement, fraud, and intentional infliction of emotional distress, seeking not just the return of my inheritance, but punitive damages for the betrayal. I also sent copies of all the evidence to his supervisor at the financial consulting firm where he worked. His company had strict ethics policies about personal financial conduct, and employees were required to report any legal issues that might affect their professional standing. Daniel had conveniently forgotten to mention that he was about to be sued for stealing nearly $200,000 from his wife. That evening, I waited in our living room with a glass of wine, and all the evidence spread out on the coffee table like a roadmap of his betrayal. When Daniel walked through the door, legal papers crumpled in his fist and panic written all over his face, I was ready for him. "We need to talk," he started, but I held up my hand to stop him. "No, Daniel, you need to listen." I watched the color drain from his face as I walked him through everything I knew. The bank transfers, the fake business, the hotel receipts, the text messages about his boring wife, the apartment he'd helped Clara rent with my grandmother's money. Every lie, every betrayal, every moment he'd looked me in the eye and pretended to care about my recovery while plotting to steal my future. "It's not what you think," he kept saying. But I had documentation for everything. There was no room for excuses or explanations. The evidence spoke for itself. "You stole from me while I was fighting for my life," I said quietly. "You used my grandmother's death and my illness as opportunities to fund your affair, and you thought I was too weak and trusting to ever figure it out." The look in his eyes shifted from panic to something that might have been fear. For the first time since I'd known him, Daniel realized he was dealing with someone who wasn't going to be manipulated or controlled. Someone who had been 3 steps ahead of him from the moment she discovered his betrayal. "What do you want?" he asked. and I almost laughed at the question. "I want you out of my house tonight. I want every penny of my inheritance returned, and I want you to understand that this is just the beginning." The dominoes started falling faster than I'd expected. Within 24 hours of serving Daniel with papers, Clara lost access to all the money she'd been living on. Her bank accounts were frozen pending the federal investigation I'd triggered, and she couldn't access a single dollar of my inheritance. The eviction notice from Marcus meant she had 48 hours to get out of the apartment she'd been treating like her personal palace. I heard through Sarah's contacts that Clara had called Daniel in a complete panic, screaming about the frozen accounts and demanding to know what was happening. But Daniel had his own problems. His supervisor at the financial firm had placed him on immediate suspension, pending an internal investigation into his conduct. The company couldn't risk keeping an employee who was facing criminal charges for financial fraud, especially not one who had access to client accounts and sensitive financial information. The Portland financial community is smaller than people think, and word travels fast. By the end of the week, everyone in Daniel's professional circle knew about the lawsuit and the theft allegations. His reputation, which he'd spent years building, was destroyed overnight. Clients started requesting different advisors. Colleagues stopped returning his calls. The professional network he'd been so proud of turned their backs on him completely. Clara tried to reach out to me directly, leaving voicemails that ranged from tearful apologies to angry threats. In one message, she claimed she'd been manipulated by Daniel and had no idea the money was stolen. In another, she accused me of being vindictive and promised to fight back. I saved every message as additional evidence of her awareness of the fraud, but I never responded. There was nothing she could say that would change what she'd done. The fake business registration complaint I'd filed was moving through the system quickly. Pacific Coast Wellness Solutions was officially flagged as a fraudulent entity, and Clara was facing potential criminal charges for business fraud, in addition to the theft and embezzlement charges related to my inheritance. The state investigators were particularly interested in whether she'd used the fake business to defraud other potential investors. Daniel's attempts to contact me became increasingly desperate. He showed up at my office, sent flowers with apology cards, and even tried to go through mutual friends to arrange a meeting. Each time, I had the same response delivered through Jennifer. All communication needed to go through our lawyers. I was done listening to his excuses and manipulation. The most satisfying moment came when I learned that Clara had been forced to move back in with her parents in Beaverton. The woman who'd been living like a millionaire in downtown Portland was now sleeping in her childhood bedroom, explaining to her family why federal agents had frozen her bank accounts. Her social media went completely silent. All those glamorous vacation photos and luxury lifestyle posts suddenly disappeared. Daniel's company completed their internal review and terminated his employment for cause. Not only was he fired, but they reported him to the state licensing board, which meant his financial advisor certification was under review. Even if he somehow avoided criminal charges, his career in finance was effectively over. No reputable firm would hire someone with his history. The criminal investigation was moving forward on multiple fronts. The FBI had taken over the case due to the interstate nature of some of the financial transactions, and they were building a comprehensive case against both Daniel and Clara. Jennifer warned me that criminal cases could take months or even years to resolve, but the civil lawsuit was moving much faster. Within 6 weeks of filing the lawsuit, Daniel's lawyer approached Jennifer about a settlement. He was hemorrhaging money on legal fees and facing the possibility of having to liquidate assets to pay damages. His new reality was a studio apartment in Gresham and a job search that wasn't going well, given that his name was now associated with theft and fraud in every Google search. Clara, meanwhile, had disappeared entirely. Her parents told investigators she'd left Oregon and wasn't in contact with them. There were rumors she'd gone to California, or maybe Arizona, but nobody seemed to know for sure. Running away didn't make her legal problems disappear, but it did make her look even more guilty. The settlement negotiations revealed just how thoroughly Daniel's life had fallen apart. He'd already spent most of his savings on legal fees and living expenses since losing his job. The expensive lifestyle he'd been planning with Clara was a fantasy that had evaporated along with his career and reputation. He was willing to do almost anything to avoid a public trial that would expose even more details about his betrayal. But I wasn't interested in making things easy for him. The money was important. But it wasn't just about getting my inheritance back anymore. It was about making sure he understood the consequences of what he'd done. He'd gambled our entire life together on a fantasy with Clara, and I wanted him to live with the results of that choice. Jennifer negotiated aggressively, demanding not just the full return of my inheritance, but additional damages for emotional distress, legal fees, and punitive damages for the deliberate nature of his betrayal. Daniel's lawyer kept trying to negotiate down the numbers, but we had too much evidence and too strong a case. He was in no position to make demands. The final settlement was more than I'd originally hoped for. Full restitution of my inheritance plus interest, coverage of all my legal fees, and a substantial additional payment for damages. Daniel had to liquidate his retirement accounts and sell his car to make the payments, but that wasn't my problem anymore. He'd made his choices, and now he was living with the consequences. Recovery took longer than I expected, and I'm not just talking about my physical health. The betrayal left scars that went deeper than any surgery could reach. For months, I questioned everything about my judgment, my ability to trust, my worth as a person. How could I have been so blind to what was happening right under my nose? How could someone I loved so completely have seen me as nothing more than a source of money to steal? But slowly, I started to rebuild. The first step was moving out of the house Daniel and I had shared. Every room held memories of our life together, and I couldn't heal while surrounded by reminders of his lies. I found a bright apartment in the Alberta Arts District, with huge windows and hardwood floors that creaked in a comforting way. It was smaller than our old house, but it was mine, and that made all the difference. My architecture firm had suffered during my illness and the legal battle that followed. Some clients had moved on, concerned about my ability to complete their projects, but others had waited, and their loyalty meant everything to me. I threw myself back into work with a passion I hadn't felt in years. Designing became my therapy, creating beautiful spaces where people could build honest lives together. The settlement money allowed me to expand the firm in ways I'd always dreamed about. I hired 2 junior architects, both women who brought fresh perspectives and incredible talent. We moved into a larger office space with a proper conference room and a design studio that felt like something out of a magazine. For the first time since starting my business, I felt like I was building something that would last. Jennifer became more than just my lawyer during this process. She became a friend, someone who understood what I'd been through, and never made me feel weak for having trusted Daniel. We started meeting for coffee every few weeks, and she introduced me to other women who'd survived similar betrayals. There was something powerful about sharing stories with people who truly understood the unique pain of being betrayed by someone you'd trusted completely. The criminal case against Daniel and Clara was still working its way through the system, but I'd stopped following every development. Jennifer kept me informed of major updates, but I was focused on moving forward rather than looking backward. Daniel had pled guilty to several charges and received probation plus community service. Clara was eventually found in Phoenix and faced her own legal consequences. Their punishment mattered less to me than my own healing. About a year after everything fell apart, I ran into Daniel at a coffee shop downtown. He looked older, worn down by everything that had happened. He was working as a bookkeeper for a small nonprofit, a dramatic step down from his previous career. When he saw me, he started to approach, but I shook my head. We had nothing to say to each other anymore. Later, I realized that seeing him didn't hurt the way I'd expected it to. The man I'd loved and trusted had been a fiction, a character he'd played to gain access to my life and resources. The person sitting in that coffee shop was a stranger who'd stolen from me and lied to me, but he wasn't someone who had power over my emotions anymore. My business continued to grow, and I started specializing in designing spaces for women who were rebuilding their lives after major changes. Divorce, career transitions, empty nest syndrome, recovery from illness. There was something deeply satisfying about helping other women create homes that reflected their authentic selves, rather than the compromises they'd made for other people. I also started speaking at events for women entrepreneurs and survivors of financial abuse. Sharing my story was difficult at first, but it became empowering. So many women had similar experiences, and seeing someone who'd not just survived but thrived gave them hope for their own futures. Dating wasn't something I was ready for, and maybe I never would be. The thought of trusting someone with my heart and my financial security again felt impossible. But I was building a different kind of life, one centered around my work, my friendships, and my own growth. I had a community of strong women around me, a business I was proud of, and a future that belonged entirely to me. On quiet Sunday mornings in my sunny apartment, I'd make coffee and think about my grandmother. She would have been proud of how I'd fought for what was mine, how I'd refused to let Daniel and Clara's betrayal define me. The inheritance money she'd left me was supposed to help me build a secure future, and in the end, that's exactly what it had done, just not in the way any of us had expected. People often tell me how strong I am, how impressed they are that I was able to turn such a terrible situation around. But strength isn't something you choose in a moment of crisis. It's something you build over time, through small daily decisions to keep moving forward even when everything feels impossible. I didn't just survive what Daniel and Clara did to me. I used their betrayal as fuel to build something better than what I'd lost. The life I have now is entirely my own creation, built on a foundation of hard-won wisdom and uncompromising honesty. Nobody can take that away from me, and nobody ever will again.